Looks like we've got most people coming in from the waiting room here. We welcome everyone to Knitting 102, the Purl Stitch. Hopefully that's all what you're here for this Monday afternoon. Darren will be your teacher. He's there on screen modeling his lovely hat. My name's Claire. I'll be hanging out in the Zoom chat and answering all your questions there. Just a reminder that this class is being recorded, so if you need to go back and watch it again as many times as you need, you can do that tomorrow at michaels.com/classes. And if you have any questions, put them in the Zoom chat. I'll either answer them there or I'll forward them to Darren. And with all of that said, let's let Darren take over.
Okay, welcome to class. Today we're going to learn how to do the purl stitch. Really in knitting, there are only two main stitches, the knit and the purl. So once you've learned the purl stitch and you're able to work it comfortably, you're well on your way to doing all the advanced knitting projects that you want. So you'll be ready to learn all kinds of different things. After that, there's some increases and decreases, but pretty much the knit and the purl are what you're going to be using almost all the time. So this is an exciting class because it'll get you on your way to making all kinds of great textures and fabrics. So let's go ahead and get started. Go ahead and change the view to the view of my hands. Get this right, okay. So just a quick review so I can contrast the differences between them. Try to get my lighting right so it doesn't cast a shadow. The knit stitch, when we do the knit stitch, we enter the stitch this way. The yarn is in the back. We wrap the yarn, bring it through, and transfer it over. So that's the knit stitch. So for the purl stitch, we need to do it a little differently. The first thing we're going to do different is we're going to bring our yarn to the front. So we're going to bring our yarn to the side closest to you, and that's considered the front of your knitting. And instead of entering the stitch this way, we're going to enter the stitch this direction. So it's more like we're diving into the stitch. So we enter the stitch from the top, we dive into the stitch, and we make an X with our needles. And then we take our working yarn, we wrap it around, and I'll show you a couple different ways to accomplish this. You wrap it around your right hand needle, and the motion this time is more like pushing it back through. With the knit stitch, we pull it through, but with the purl stitch, we're going to push it back through and then transfer it over. So I'll show you that again, and then we'll ask questions. Make sure everything's in the right position. So you enter the stitch by diving into it this direction. Wrap your yarn around your right hand needle. We're going to push that loop, push that yarn back through to bring up a loop, and then transfer it over. And that is the purl stitch. Do we have any questions about that?
We do have a general question. When would you use a purl stitch?
All right, so the purl stitch, let me just talk about the knit stitch then for a minute. So this is what we learned last week. We made this cowl. And if you only do the knit stitch on the front and the back of every row, you create this type of fabric. And it's a very nice fabric because it's reversible. It has nice texture. It's kind of soft and spongy. But if you learn to do the purl stitch, that's when you can create other types of fabric. So this is called Stockinette Stitch. So Stockinette Stitch, we have all of our knits on one side, and we're putting all of our purls on the other side. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and how to tell the difference. And then here we have ribbing. So this is a knit 2, purl 2 ribbing. And once you learn how to do the purl stitch, you'll be able to make nice ribbing on the edges of your garments. And not just these two types of fabrics, it's unlimited. You can do seed stitch, you can do moss stitch, you can do all kinds of things. I mean, there's just all kinds of things that can be done once you learn how to accomplish the purl stitch. Okay, and we're going to talk about how the knit stitch and the purl stitch kind of work together to create these fabrics. It's kind of like a little magic trick, really. All right, so I'm going to demonstrate the purl stitch again.
Darren, your camera's at kind of a weird angle. I feel like I'm looking at you with my head tilted. Beth.
Is that better?
Oh, almost. That's better.
That's better. Okay.
And we had a couple general questions for people who are starting with empty needles. How many should they cast on just for practicing in class?
Just for practice. Okay, go ahead.
And is casting on the same for starting with a purl stitch versus starting with a knit stitch?
Yeah, so okay, so these are all very good questions. Casting on is exactly the same. So however you want to cast on, feel free to cast on anyway. And don't cast on too many stitches for practice. Do like 10 to 20, maybe just so that you have enough to work through, but you don't want to have so many that you're going to be working through too many. So go ahead and let's do a number that's divisible by 4. So let's do 20. Cast on 20 once we get that far, and then you'll be able to practice. Okay, so do the so you enter the stitch this direction, make the X, wrap your right hand needle, and push that back through. Okay, is anyone let me do it with my left hand to show the couple of different ways you can do it. I don't usually do it this way, so it's not quite very smooth. But this is the Continental method, and if you get good at the Continental method, which I am not good at it, it is quite a bit faster. You can see I'm quite clumsy at it. But same motion, you're holding your yarn out with your left hand, and you're diving into the stitch. You can either wrap the yarn or you pick up the yarn with the needle. But the main difference is, or the same thing, you have to wrap it the same direction. So if I pick up the needle, the yarn's going in that direction, or if I wrap the needle, the yarn's going in that direction. And then you just have to hold it in place as you push it through. This is a little harder, but if you're a continental knitter, that's the way to do it. And this is how I do it in real life, which is kind of a combination of the two. But most people will probably tell you the British method is the most common, and that's how I was doing it before, and I'll demonstrate that again. All right, so now that I'm at the end of the row, I'm going to just take a second and look at your work and make sure everything looks all right. Put it back in your left hand, and then we're ready to start working again. So any questions at this point? Do we feel good about the purl stitch? Any questions? So starting at the beginning of the row, I'm going to take my working yarn, pull it to the front to get it in the right position right from the start for my purl stitches. So bring it to the front. And then you dive into the stitch. Do it with my right hand. This is the British method. Wrap your yarn and then push it back through. And that's the purl stitch. So there's different types of ways people hold their yarn. The way I'm holding it is the British method or Western knitting, and other people hold their yarn and they guide it with their left hand. And this is called Continental, where you hold it with your, tension it with your finger this way and dive into it. But either way you're knitting is fine. You don't have to do both. You only have to learn one way that's the most comfortable in your hand, and then you'll be set. So I just like to demonstrate different ways because sometimes people naturally hold the yarn in their left hand. So I like to demonstrate for as many students as I can that are learning differently. Yeah, and purling is a little harder than knitting, and I'm not sure why, but most people don't like purling. They'd rather do knit stitches. But we need the purl to create our variety of fabrics. All right, so I'm almost to the end of the row, and if we don't have any other questions, I'll demonstrate stockinette stitch. Okay, any questions as I get to the end of this row?
Looks like we've got a couple people who'd like to go over how you keep the yarn on your needle as you're pulling it from the stitch, or how do you keep the loose yarn from twisting?
Yeah, that's kind of the trick. That's kind of where lots of practice comes in. So let me see if I understand the question. How to bring the yarn through the loop?
Right, since you're sort of pushing it away from yourself, I guess it's probably easier for the yarn to fall off the needle.
Yeah. So you wrap it, and you can put, I hesitate to use the word tight because you don't want to put real tight, but you can put very snug around that needle, and you can kind of hold it with your thumb and then push the needle through, and it should stay on. But it is one of those things that's going to take some practice. So you probably don't want to have just the very tip of your needle, because then it might be more easy to fall off. So go ahead and push the needle through a little more, wrap it, hold it kind of snug. You can secure it with your thumb, and then you can put your pointer finger on your other hand on that loop to kind of manage where that is, and then just pull it through or push it through. It's more of a pushing motion. Then transfer it over. Does that help? And then Claire, what was the other question?
Oh, let me scroll back here.
Something about the yarn twisting, or
so how do you keep the loose yarn from twisting?
what, like your working yarn?
That's all they said.
Mine just doesn't seem to twist. So I think that might be something that just comes with practice as well. If it's twisting, I'm not sure. I'm not sure why.
I wonder if it's the yarn coming from the ball that is like twisting up on itself.
Okay, yeah, if that's it, just pull more yarn out of the ball and give yourself more slack. Wouldn't you think, Claire?
You can do that. You also might be wrapping the yarn in the same direction as the twist of the yarn, and then you're adding more twist to it, sort of like kinks back up on itself. And if you aren't too far in your project, what I would suggest then is ripping out and starting over from the other end of the ball. And so then when you wrap the yarn, you're going against the twist in the yarn, and it'll sort of bounce each other out.
Yeah, good idea. Okay, so now I'm just knitting. I'm working on stockinette stitch. So what you do for stockinette stitch is you knit one complete row, and then you turn your work, and the next row you purl the entire row. So last week when we did garter stitch, we knitted front and back. Now this week, we've learned a new stitch, so we're going to knit one entire row and then purl one entire row. And this is how I purl. I purl with my left hand like that. And it's not a very fast way of doing it, but it's a way that I like it. This is more the British method where you're purling with you're wrapping the yarn with your right hand. And there's lots of different ways of achieving the same thing. And I know Claire knits, she wraps the yarn with her right hand, but she just kind of flicks it around with her finger. What's that called, Claire? Is that picking, or what would you call that?
Nope, it's also English knitting or British. I just happen to hold the yarn in my right hand and do it all with that.
Yep. It's very fast. So there's lots of different, you'll see people knitting in lots of different ways. And it doesn't mean that their way's better or your way's better or worse. It's just lots of different ways. So be prepared for that if you're ever allowed to go to knitting groups again and join up with people, and you'll see people doing it all kinds of ways. So I'm almost to the end of my row. So I did one whole row of knits, and now I just finished one whole row of purls, and we're going to look at it and see if that does anything for us. See what that does. It should make it look a little different, don't you think? All right, so don't drop any stitches. Okay, so you can see it looks different because we did something different. So this here, the bottom of it is garter stitch, where I was knitting every row to get myself started. And then this new fabric, this new texture, is called Stockinette Stitch. And the way we achieved that was we knitted one whole row and then we purled one whole row. So we put all of our knit stitches on one side and we put all of our purl stitches on the other side. Now here's where the tricky bit comes in. Let me see if I can zoom in on this a little bit. Well, let me zoom in. Okay, I'll hold it up. So here's where it's not really tricky, but it's kind of when you're first learning it. This stitch right here, that is a knit stitch, and that it's kind of shaped like a V. So you're going to hear a lot of talk about the V, looking for the V's. That is a knit stitch. It's shaped like a V. I'll isolate that for you. Right here. And if you kind of help it at the bottom, you can see it's shaped like a V. So that is a knit stitch. Now a purl stitch, if we look at the other side, these purl stitches here are, first of all, they're not shaped like a V. So that's kind of how we can tell they're purl stitches, but they are shaped more like a bump. So you're going to hear people speaking about purls, Purl bumps or purl ridges. So you're going to see these bumps, and it's much more textural when you get them all together in like a big field of purls. It's much more textural. So purl stitches look like little bumps. If you squish them together, they kind of looks like a little bead. Or maybe the original people that learned about or invented knitting, maybe it looked like a purl to them, and that's why it's spelled differently, but you know, it kind of looks like a little round bead or a little round purl. So that's a good way of remembering it. And then the knit side looks like these V's. So here's a question. So this is the knit side and this is the purl side. So here's the secret life of the knit and purl. There's a secret about the knit and the purl stitch. And the secret is they're the exact same stitch. So that's the secret. The secret about the knit and the purl stitch is they're the exact same stitch, but they look different from the front and the back. So that's the only difference between the knit and the purl, is they look different from the front and the back. So when you're creating a knit stitch on the front of your work, you're also putting a purl stitch on the back of your work. So you're not just working on the front of your work, you have to think of it as kind of double-sided. So you're working on the front and the back at the same time. So that's kind of a way you can think of it. But whenever you make a knit stitch on the front of your work, you're putting a purl stitch on the back. And when you're putting a purl stitch on the back of your work, it turns into a knit stitch on the front. And the way you can kind of look at that is, so we talked about the V shape being a knit stitch. So that's a knit stitch, we're pretty sure. And if we turn it over and look at the back of that stitch, we're looking at a purl stitch. So that is the secret life of the knit and the purl stitch, is they're the exact same stitch, except they look different from front and back. You look different from the front and from the back. So the knit stitch wants to be like everybody else, and it wants to look different from the front and the back. You can think of it like a coin, like heads or tails of a coin. It's the same coin, but it's just different on the front and the back. So for some reason, when I learned, I taught myself how to knit, and when I learned, that really confused me. Like I couldn't grasp what was happening, but it's actually really simple. So any questions about that? About stockinette stitch, or about the purl stitch and the knit stitch and how they work together? I'm sure there probably
did
will
have
be
a
lots.
couple questions to show the purl stitch again, especially to show how to do it with Continental.
Okay.
And we've also had a couple questions about the first or last stitch being a little bit looser than everybody else.
The reason the first and the last stitch are a little bit looser, the knit stitches or purl stitches in this regard are only truly well behaved if they have a stitch above them, below them, and to the left and to the right. So if they're supervised on all edges, then it keeps the tension even and they're very well behaved. But given any freedom at all, they're going to act up. So like this guy here, this corner one, it's being supervised at the bottom and it's being supervised on the side, and it's got this stitch on the top, but it doesn't have any stitch holding it here. So it's going to act up on this side, but the tension's just going to be a little uneven. But by the time this stitch above it gets finished and you knitted a couple rows above it, then that pulls the tension and it'll straighten out a little bit. They might always be a little uneven, but there's some tricks you can learn later on that can kind of, a lot of times that'll end up being in your seam. And there's a few other things you can do later on to help even that out. So, but let's demonstrate the purl stitch. Okay. So if I'm going to work the purl, first of all, this is my knit side, but I'm going to work the purl stitch on this for demonstration purposes. So you bring your yarn to the front. It's the first thing, so that you can have it ready. You dive into the stitch this way, kind of make the X, wrap your yarn around the needle with left hand or right hand, however you like. I kind of hold my working yarn down and tension it, and then I push it through and then transfer it over. And if you're going to do it continental, which I don't recommend trying unless if you already know a little bit about continental. The continental purl is quite hard to learn. You pick it up this way, and then you have to bring your yarn down and hold it in place to transfer it over. So dive into it. But again, you don't need to learn this method. There's many methods of doing it. And whichever one feels the most comfortable in your hand is the right method. And then after you get good at it, you can practice and learn other methods. All right. Any questions about that? Are we making purl stitches yet? Are we able to do some of them?
It sounds like people are, because they're jumping ahead and they have a question. If you put your work down and then you go to pick it back up, how do you tell if you're going to start with a knit row or a purl row?
Okay, so for stockinette stitch, let me finish my row and we'll look at it. For stockinette stitch, it is very important. One side will be knit and one side will be purl. You don't want to mix them up or else you'll end up with a purl ridge on one side. And if you do it on purpose and space them out nicely, then it can make a nice textural tone on tone stripe. But if you do it by mistake, then you might be unhappy with that. So let me finish my row. And I did a purl row on my knit side to demonstrate the purl. So it'll be a perfect example of what it looks like if you do it that way. Okay, so I'll put down my work, pick it up, and now what am I supposed to be doing? Okay, so there's my working yarn. I'll hold it in my hand like I'm going to start. And so if I'm looking at these stitches, what kind of stitches do we think they are? Are they knits or are they purls? So if we're looking for knit stitches, we're going to look for those V shapes. So this side, they look more like V shapes on this side. I can see the V shapes right here. Kind of creates a zigzag line if you think of it that way. But right here, you can see very clearly that is shaped like a V. So this must be the knit side. And what's left? The only other choice is this is the purl side. And if we want to see the bumps, here's the purl bumps. You can see how it looks very textural. This one kind of creates a wavy line, if you kind of look at it that way, like waves. So if you think of waves in the ocean, where do you find a purl? In the ocean. Okay, does that help? And then if you're doing stockinette stitch, you want to do whichever stitch you're looking at. So if you pick up your work, you position it to be where it needs to be for you to start. Take a minute and look at it and think about it. These are purl stitches, so that means I have to do a purl stitch. And another thing you can do, once you are 100% sure which side is the knit side and which side is the purl side, you can mark it with a stitch marker or a safety pin. And you know, okay, every time I see the safety pin, I know I'm on the purl side or knit side, whichever side you decide to put it on. And that can help you remember as a beginner, so you don't have to struggle with it every time. But eventually it'll become second nature. You'll look at them and you'll instantly know exactly what they are, I promise. It really does become second nature. But if you're making stockinette stitch, you always want to make, once you establish your stitches, you always want to make whichever stitch you're looking at as you're working, and that will be correct. So I'm looking at purl stitches. I'm going to make some purl stitches. And these are all very good questions that come up a lot. Any other questions about this?
We've got a question about how you would count rows in a stockinette stitch fabric. Is it one row of knit and one row of purl equals one row?
Actually, yes. Let me.
Wait, sorry, I don't think I asked that correctly. I've gotten the question before from other people where they think, okay, if my pattern says work 10 rows in stockinette, that means that I need to knit one row, turn around and purl one row, and then I will have completed one row of those 10.
No, it's yeah, if you've knitted one row and you've purled one row, that equals 2 rows, right? Every time you do a row, I want credit every time I do something. So I think every time we work and we do a whole row, I think we should get credit for it and we should count it. Don't you, Claire?
Whoops, I muted myself. Yes, exactly.
Okay. I thought you were going to argue with me for a minute there.
No.
Okay, so if we're going to count our rows, what we want to do is we want to find this V shape. If you look at it, half of one stitch and half of another stitch, it forms an upside down V, or kind of an A. So you want to find this V, and then you just count them. So 1, 2, and I'm looking through my camera, so I'm having a hard time seeing exactly. 3. So you just count the V shapes. Let's look at this one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So, and if you think about it, when I created the stitches on the other side, which were purl stitches, what happens to the right side? I'm putting knit stitches. So when I was working on my purl stitches on this side, I was putting a knit stitch on this side. So some of these knit stitches were actually created when I was putting purl stitches on the other side. So basically every other row were created as knits or purls, but it doesn't make any difference. What makes the difference is what you're looking at. So now that I'm looking at these stitches, these are all knit stitches. And it doesn't matter. So when you're working that second row of purl bumps on the back of your stockinette stitch, you're putting a row of knit stitches on the front, and each row will count. Okay, does that answer that question? Or did it make it more, sometimes it makes it more confusing.
Follow-up question, do you count the stitches that are on the needle, or as the row that's on the needle?
Yes, because it's again, you want to get credit for your work. Right, Claire?
Yes, let's make sure we give ourselves proper credit here.
Yeah, I want credit for all the work I'm doing. So, all right, are we ready to talk about ribbing, or do we have more questions about any of these topics?
I think we better move on to ribbing because we're about halfway through our class already.
Okay, so we'll move on to ribbing. And as I'm doing that, you guys can all think of whatever questions you might have. I'm going to raise my camera just a little bit. All right, so ribbing, you do have to be careful and you have to pay attention to what you're doing because it's easy to make a mistake. So I'm going to start out with knit 2, purl 2 ribbing. And so I'm going to be working over 4 stitches. I'm knitting 2 and I'm purling 2. So that counts as a 4-stitch repeat. So you would need to cast on a number that's divisible by 4 if you're going to work a 4-stitch repeat so that you complete the whole repeat. So I'm going to knit 2. And what do we know about the purl stitch? The first thing we do when we purl is we have to bring the yarn on the front side of the fabric. So after you've finished your knit stitch, you have to come to a full stop, open your needles like this, bring the yarn through, so it's like you're scoring a field goal, bring the yarn through. Now that the yarn's in the front, I can do as many purl stitches as I need to for the pattern. So I'm going to do 2 purl stitches. Now I want to do 2 knit stitches. So I have to reposition my yarn again. Come to a full stop, open up your needles. The yarn has to go in between the needles. And now I can do 2 knit stitches. Now I'm going to show you what happens if you do it incorrectly. And sometimes this might happen. So sometimes people bring their yarn to the front like that. And then they want to work their purl stitch. Do 2 purl stitches. But let's see what happens. So that doesn't look right. So anytime your yarn gets looped around your needle, either on purpose or accident, you run the risk of creating a new stitch. So if you loop your yarn around your needle, then that could very easily turn into a stitch, and that's called a yarn over. So if you're finding holes in your work and you're adding a stitch, that's probably what's happening, is you're doing an accidental yarn over. And people do that like when they're knitting garter stitch as well. It can happen anytime, but it happens a lot in the ribbing because you're constantly removing the position of your yarn. So that's why I say come to a full stop, bring it in. You have to score that field goal, right? If it goes like this, if it doesn't go through the field goal, if it goes on the side of it, then you don't get a point. That doesn't count. So it has to come through the field goal. And now I'm ready to do 2 purl stitches. Okay. And then once you get comfortable with it, you don't have to be so dramatic about full stop through the field goal, but it is good for practicing because you want to make sure you do learn that. Any questions about that? Full stop through the field goal.
We've got some appreciation for your field goal metaphor there.
Yeah, there's not going to be many sports references. Diving into the stitch and the field goal, that's it. That's all I got.
We've got a good general question. What is ribbing for?
Okay. So here's one thing. I didn't count my stitches. I just randomly cast on a number. So my number is not divisible by 4. So I am not going to be able to finish. So I have 2 knit stitches. To finish my repeat, I should be able to do 2 purl stitches. But since I didn't plan it out, it's not going to work out quite that way. So I'm going to add another stitch real quick. And this is next week. Nobody saw anything. Okay. So the reason you use ribbing, a couple of different reasons you might choose to use ribbing is, first of all, where do you normally see ribbing on your knitted items? So you normally see ribbing along the edges of your items. Ribbing kind of pulls in, it's kind of elastic, and it lays flat. That's one of the main benefits of it, is because it does lay flat. So you find ribbing on the edges of your sweaters, around the waistline, around the sleeves, around the neck. You find ribbing on the bottom edge of hats like this one. If this were a glove, the ribbing would be on the edge of the glove. What that does, it kind of holds it in place, kind of holds the shape because it squeezes in a little bit, and it keeps your knitted item laying flat. If sometimes in a pattern, they will even have you knit the ribbing on a smaller needle to make it even more tight, all right? So that's where you would use ribbing. Stockinette Stitch always curls. So it's a beautiful fabric, but it always rolls like this. And if I didn't have ribbing at the bottom of this, it would roll this direction too. So the problem with knitting and purling is that the knit stitch wants to curl that way, and the purl stitch wants to go along with it. So they all happily just roll up together. And when you have ribbing, you've got your knit stitches one way and your purl stitches the other way. And the knit stitch wants to curl this way, but these knit stitches want to curl that way. So what happens is they're both trying to curl in opposite directions and they hold themselves straight. That's why it doesn't curl when you have knits and purls alternating. But if you have them all facing the same way, then they're all happy to curl up in a nice tube together. And what happens is people will knit a stockinette stitch scarf. So we all have to do this as knitters. It's a mistake we all have to make. Maybe you can not make this mistake, but we all knit the stockinette stitch scarf because stockinette stitch is so pretty. And then it's like, why is it rolling up into a tube? This yarn's defective. Something must be wrong with the yarn, right? Well, no, that's just how stockinette stitch works. It always, so do not knit the stockinette stitch scarf, the dreaded stockinette stitch scarf. It'll curl right up in a little tube. So you've probably had sweaters where the sleeve you had a rolled edge on the sleeve or a rolled edge on the neck, and they're really cute, and um, it's a great idea as long as you're planning for it. Okay, any questions?
Teresa just has a follow-up question. So the curling isn't caused by short or long needles or needle type or anything like that.
No, no, it's just caused by the knits and the purls that are the way they're lined up. So you get the knits on one side and the purls on the other side. Okay. Any questions?
Oh, we did have a good one from Noelle. If when you purl and wrap the yarn in the other direction, does it make a big difference?
If you wrap it the wrong direction,
If you wrap it the other direction around your needle, yeah.
yes, that causes twisted stitches. And it's not the end of the world. It's not going to ruin everything, but it will affect the way it looks on the right side of your work. So you want to make sure that you're not doing that. So if you have twisted stitches, and we're going to go over that in the Knitting Doctor in Knitting 104, your stitches will kind of look like this. They'll almost look like little X's instead of nice V shapes. Okay. So you always want to make sure you are wrapping. That's why it's important to insert your yarn in the right place to wrap your yarn the right direction. Okay. Any other questions?
So you covered moving the yarn when you go from a knit stitch to a purl stitch. You need to move it again when you go from a purl stitch to a knit stitch.
Yes. So let's see here. Okay, so start with my 2 knits. Bring it to the front. Do my 2 purls. Reposition it to the back. So again, make sure you're getting the field goal going the other direction. Make sense? And then when you're working ribbing, once you establish your knits and purls in the order that they're going to be in, you just want to make sure that you're always knitting your knits and purling your purls. You want to stack up your knits on top of each other and stack up your purls on top of each other. And that will give you a nice clean ribbing. Now let's look at these stitches. Now that we have them next to each other, we can kind of look and see what the difference is between the knits and the purls.
Oops, sorry, Darren. I might have muted you by accident because there was an echo. I was trying to figure out where that was coming from.
All right, so you find the knit stitch. It's the V shape. And then the one right next to it is the purl stitch. And again, that looks like a little bump or a little pearl, a little bead. The purl stitches are bumped up tight against the needle, and the knit stitches are hanging down below the needle. So it's quite an extreme difference between them. So if you look at the difference between them, it'll get quite easy for you to tell the difference. So there is the purl because it's bumped up tight against the needle and it's not shaped like a V. And then the knit stitch is hanging down and it is shaped like a V. So that is how you tell the difference. Any questions about that? No? Okay, Questions about anything we've covered so far?
We did have a question a little while back about seed stitch, but I don't know if we want to go into that in this class.
No, I don't think we want to go into that in this class, but after you practice the knit and the purl and learning to identify the difference between them, then it's a good time to try seed stitch, because you do really need to be able to see what stitch is what, or you'll mix it up very easily. So, any other questions?
We have a question about how you know how to start the second row of ribbing. Do you start with 2 knits again, or do you start with 2 purls?
That depends on the pattern you're working. So what you want to do is you want to look and see what stitches are what, and then you want to work the stitches that you're looking at. So remember, we talked about once you establish your ribbing, then you will just continue. Like I have 2 purls here. We know they're purls because they have the little purl bumps. And then I have 2 knits right next to them. And I know they're knits because I can see the V shapes. So, and remember, I didn't have the right number cast on. So my first one is actually a knit, just one random stitch. And then I'm going to look at these stitches and make a decision. Am I going to knit, or am I going to purl? So that's when you make the decision. So you don't just pick it up and randomly start knitting or purling. You want to look at your work, you want to make a decision and think about it, and then go with what you think is best. Is it a knit or is it a purl, and what should I be doing? Does that help with that question?
I think so. And learning to read your knitting is a skill that's going to come with practice, which is not everyone's favorite thing, I know.
Plug my computer in, sorry. Didn't realize it was unplugged. Okay. Any other questions?
We've got a few people wondering how you would prevent stockinette stitch from curling.
You wouldn't. You wouldn't. The only way to keep it from curling is to staple it to the wall, and it will not curl as long as it's stapled to the wall. And then when you take the staples out, it's going to curl right back up again. It's like if you have curly hair, how do you keep curly hair from curling? You can straighten it, but it's going to revert back to curly. You just can't fight nature, right? Okay, so I finished my row. Put it down, come back an hour later. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. So I'm going to look at it and think about it and make a decision. Sometimes these edge stitches, because it does kind of curl on the edge, they're a little hard to tell what they are. So if you move into here, the body of your work, what stitch is this? What do you think that is? What do you think these are? These are knit stitches, right? You can see the V shape, and they're hanging down below the needle. So 2 knit stitches, 2 purl stitches, because they're bumps and they're bumped up against the edge of the needle. So that must mean these on the end are 2 knit stitches. Let's see if we can find them. Yeah, so there is our V for that one. And this one, even though it's loose, I can still find that V shape right here. Okay, so that's how we decide how, and I'm going to look at that and decide these are 2 knit stitches, so I'm going to start with 2 knits. Purls. reposition my needle, do 2 knits, reposition my needle, or reposition, open my needles, reposition my yarn, 2 purls, so if you're counting it, see, there's my V. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I want to count this one because I want credit for all of my work. If you were getting paid by every row you were knitting, you would want to count that one because you want to get paid for that one too, right? So always count each one, even the one on the needle. And this just takes a lot of practice to get comfortable with it. Just try to practice a little every day until it becomes more comfortable in your hand. That's really the only way to accomplish it. And before you know it, you'll be shocked. It will actually be comfortable in your hand and you'll be doing it and it won't be hard. Okay, any questions about anything we've covered so far? I'd like to quickly go over the pattern so that you'll be able to make this hat because there's the little seaming technique I want to show you. So here's the pattern. It should be in your handout. So if you receive the handout, this should be part of the handout. So if I think it's on page 9, Claire said earlier. So if you look through your handout, you should find this. If not, it is available on lionbrand.com. It's a free printout. So a couple of things I wanted to point out about this one. This one is calling for Heartland Thick and Quick yarn, which is a discontinued yarn. So you can't get it. So what I did was I kept this pattern in my class on purpose because I wanted to show you what you do if you can't get the yarn the pattern calls for. So I know that yarn is a bulky weight number 5, but I also am familiar with that yarn. So I know it's a very bulky weight and it is almost a number 6. So it's really close to a number 6. So that's why I'm using this yarn is what I'm using in class today. It's called Hometown. And this is Hometown Bonus Bundle. It's available on michaels.com or lionbrand.com and lots of good colors. This one is a bulky weight number 6, which is very similar to the yarn the pattern called for. And if you look and see what needle is recommended, this one recommends a 9mm, and that's what I'm using for class. So you don't have to do what you're told all the time, right? So if the pattern's telling you to do something, you don't have to do exactly as you're told. You can make adjustments. Okay, so it calls for Heartland Thick and Quick. You need your knitting needles, and this one is calling for an 8mm. And then you need large-eyed blunt needles for weaving in your ends. Okay, so for the hat, you're going to cast on 50 stitches. So 50 stitches is not hard to cast on. We know how to cast on. Any way you like to cast on is fine. Cast on 50. So row number 1, anytime there's an asterisk, that just means that there's something important is going to happen. And it usually means you're going to repeat something. I think it almost always means that. So there's an asterisk. We knit 2, we purl 2, and we repeat from the asterisk to the last 2 stitches, and the last 2 stitches are going to be knit 2. So we start with knit 2, and then we do knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, all the way across, ending with knit 2. The next row, we're starting with purl 2. So we're going to purl 2, knit 2, repeat to the last 2 stitches, ending with a purl 2. So once you've established your ribbing and you've got your knits and your purls kind of lining up on top of each other, that's all you need to remember. Just knit the knits as you see them and knit the purls as you see them. You're going to work, repeat rows 1 and 2 until the piece measures about 2 inches from the cast on edge. I like a little extra ribbing, so the second hat that I made out of this one, I did, I think I did 3.5 inches of ribbing. So you can do a little extra ribbing if you want to. Just make sure you're not going to run out of yarn. And after you finish your ribbing, you've got 2 inches. You're going to work in stockinette stitch, which means you're going to knit 1 whole row and you're going to purl 1 whole row. So you're going to work in stockinette stitch until the hat measures about 9 inches from the cast on edge. And then you're going to cut the yarn, leaving a 20-inch long tail. So leaving a very long tail, we're going to use that for seaming. And I'm going to show you how to finish it right now. So I've got this hat, which is knitted, but it's not finished yet. So when you get to this point and it's 9 inches from the beginning, then you're going to cut your yarn, leaving this very long tail. You're going to thread that onto a large-eyed blunt needle. And then you're going to just take that needle and you're going to put it through all the live loops that are on here. You're not going to bind off. So nothing fancy. I'm just putting all of these onto my needle and I'm going to pull my yarn through there. So any questions about this? You can see what I'm doing? You can do them one at a time. You can do a couple at a time. Just do not let any drop off. That's the important thing. You can't lose any. And just push them down onto your yarn. I'm just trying to hurry so we can get through all this stuff without keeping you too long. So when you're doing this, just take your time and do it slow. Make sure you're getting each one, transfer it over, and then pull your yarn through all those live stitches until it cinches up really tight. And then you want to kind of join it to this side because you don't want a hole on top of your hat. Now I would bring it back up through here again and pull it tight, maybe bring it up through here and down on the other side just to really make it secure. But I'm not going to do that to this hat because I'm going to be able to keep this as a sample and I don't want to sew it up too securely. But make sure, because you can see here how that's coming loose. You don't want that to come loose. So pull it really tight, go through here again and secure it and pull it really tight so it stays nice and snug. Now there are 2 different stitches. Well, there's lots of different stitches you can seam it up with, but we're going to talk about 2 stitches today. So here is our knit stitch because it's shaped like the V. We knitted it this direction. And then this is the one on the very end. And if you pull your knitting apart, you're going to see these bars that are in between your knit stitches. And what I'm going to do, this is called Mattress Stitch. Let's see. Try to get the light right. I'm going to go under it. I'm going to pick up that bar and pull it tight. And then I'm going to go on this side, pick up that bar and pull it tight. It's like climbing a ladder. You don't want to skip any rungs. And then go on this side, kind of pull up the bar like that. and then this side. And it's once you get established, it's easy because you can see where you did the previous one, and you're just going to go to the one right above it. And you just want to make sure you're going in a straight line. So right here. And you keep going like that the whole length of the hat. This is what it looks like as you're working. But if you pull this tight, then what happens is it gives you a perfect seam so that you can't even see it. So you can't even tell right there that there was a seam there. If you don't like that one, if that one's a little hard, then you can do the whip stitch. And I do recommend that you kind of secure the two edges of the hat together. You can use a clip, you can just kind of tack them together with a, you can tie a knot there, or you can use like a clip from a potato chip, like you would keep a potato chip bag closed with if you don't have these. And so the whip stitch is you're still going to work with these two stitches right on the edge. With the whip stitch, you're working with right sides together, so you're working on the wrong side. With mattress stitch, you're working on the right side of it. That's the main difference. And with this one, you just whip stitch it just like that. You want to make sure you're catching every one right here. So I'm only picking up these two stitches on these two strands of yarn on the end. That's my knit stitch. And then on this side, same thing, two strands of yarn, which create the knit stitch. And you're just, and if you don't like the way your seam turns out, if it wasn't, you thought you were being really neat, but yet it doesn't look nice, you can take it out and retry it, give it another go until you get it right. So don't let this intimidate you. And then after you're done, you'll just weave in your ends, and then you have a finished hat. I think everyone can do that with a little practice. The seaming, you know, there's lots of videos online to show you different ways of seaming. So once you get to that point, if you you can watch this video back again, or there's lots of different ways of seaming. Okay, any questions?
I was going to say, we are a little bit over time here. So just a reminder that this class is being recorded and you can watch it back tomorrow at michaels.com/classes or on the Michaels YouTube channel. If you need to watch last week's 101 class or go back, you can see those in the same places as well. Hopefully we see a bunch of you with us next week for Knitting 103.
Yeah, and if you do have any questions, you can contact me on Instagram or on TikTok. My name is Mr. Woolly Bear, Mister, spelled out Woolly Bear. And if you send me a direct message, then I do try to answer them as quickly as possible. So maybe Claire will put that in the chat so everyone can see how it's spelled. I guess that's it. Any other questions quickly? We're over a few minutes. I put a big pom-pom on this one to kind of dress it up a bit. So you can, after you make the hat, you can do all kinds of things with it. Okay, any questions? Okay, thanks for coming to class. Just remember to practice every day.